August 16, 2005. 1 in the morning, the cockpit lights glow dim against a wall of dark clouds. The aircraft shakes as turbulence grips it without warning. Inside the cabin, passengers feel the sudden drop in their stomachs. A violent shudder runs through the fuselage. Then, a harsh vibration begins. The control column starts to shake. The crew hears the warning. The aircraft is losing lift. What went wrong? Why is the aircraft falling? And what is really happening inside that storm? If you enjoy real aviation investigations like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are watching from, because what you are about to see is not just a crash. It is a mystery that took investigators years to fully understand. To understand what really happened, we need to go back to the beginning. It is late at night at Panama City Tocumen International Airport. A charter flight is preparing for departure. The passengers are returning home after a vacation. Most of them are French tourists heading back to Martinique. The mood inside the terminal is calm. Nothing suggests that this routine flight will end in disaster. The aircraft assigned for this flight is a McDonnell Douglas MD-82. It is a narrow-body jet with 2 engines mounted at the rear. This design is known for reliability and efficiency. Thousands of flights operate safely every day using this aircraft type. It is not considered dangerous. In fact, it is one of the most widely used aircraft in the world at the time. So how does a safe aircraft suddenly fall from the sky? The airline operating the flight is West Caribbean Airways. It is a Colombian charter airline. It operates flights across the Caribbean region. However, behind the scenes, the airline has been struggling. Financial problems have created pressure on operations. Maintenance standards and operational discipline are under scrutiny. But at this moment, none of that is visible to the passengers boarding the aircraft. In the cockpit, Captain Omar Ospina prepares for departure. He is experienced but under pressure. The schedule is already delayed. The turnaround must be quick. The first officer, David Munoz, is assisting him. Their coordination will soon become critical. But there is something else happening here. Something subtle. Something that will only become clear much later during the investigation. The aircraft is fully loaded. In fact, it is slightly overbooked. Even the cockpit jump seat is occupied. Some cabin crew are left behind due to lack of space. The weight calculations are done quickly. The crew believes the aircraft can safely take off, but is that calculation accurate? And could that decision matter later? The engines start, and the aircraft pushes back from the gate. The runway is clear. The night sky hides what lies ahead. The crew requests clearance and begins taxi. Everything appears normal. Then the aircraft lines up on the runway. Power is applied. The engines roar to life. The aircraft accelerates. At the correct speed, the captain pulls back. The aircraft lifts into the air. Shortly after takeoff, the aircraft begins climbing toward its cruising altitude. The planned cruise level is 33,000 feet. Initially, the aircraft levels at 31,000 feet. This is standard procedure. As fuel burns and weight decreases, the aircraft can climb higher. This process is called step climb. It improves efficiency, but it also introduces risk if conditions are not ideal. The weather ahead is already turning unstable. A low-intensity hurricane system is affecting the region. Strong winds and heavy moisture fill the atmosphere. The crew requests deviation to avoid the worst of the weather. Air traffic control approves the request. But here is the problem. The air traffic control in this region does not have radar coverage. They rely on pilot reports. That means the crew is largely on their own. As the flight continues, the aircraft climbs toward 33,000 feet. The anti-ice system is turned on earlier during the climb. This system uses hot air from the engines to prevent ice from forming on the wings. It is critical in cold and moist conditions, but it also reduces engine performance. That detail may not seem important now, but it will soon become the center of the investigation. 40 minutes into the flight, the aircraft reaches its higher altitude. The storm intensifies around them. Turbulence increases. The seatbelt sign is turned on. Passengers are instructed to remain seated. Inside the cockpit, the crew notices something unusual. The engines are not responding as expected. The aircraft does not accelerate properly. But the situation does not seem critical yet. Or does it? The first officer begins to worry about icing conditions. He asks about the anti-ice system. The captain gives instructions, but there is hesitation. The system is turned on and off at different moments. This inconsistency will later raise serious questions. Why was the system not kept on continuously? And did that decision affect the aircraft performance? the turbulence becomes more severe. The aircraft struggles to maintain stable flight. The crew decides to descend back to 31,000 feet. This is a logical step. Lower altitude means denser air and better engine performance. The autopilot is disconnected. The aircraft begins its descent. At this point, the situation is still recoverable. But something else is about to happen. Suddenly, a violent warning activates. The stick shaker begins to vibrate. This is the most serious warning a pilot can receive. It indicates that the aircraft is about to stall. A stall does not mean the engines stop. It means the wings are no longer producing enough lift. The aircraft begins to fall, and now the crew has only seconds to react. But what caused the stall at such a high altitude? The engines are still running. The aircraft is not damaged, and yet it is falling rapidly from the sky. The mystery is just beginning. The aircraft is no longer stable. At 31,000 feet, the stick shaker continues to fire. The cockpit fills with urgency. The control column vibrates violently in the captain's hands. The aircraft is telling them one thing very clearly. It is flying too slowly. It is losing lift. And if nothing changes, it will fall out of the sky. But why is the speed dropping when the engines are still running? The captain reacts immediately, but his focus is divided. He believes something is wrong with the engines. The first officer is trying to understand the situation. He calls out that it is a stall, but there is hesitation. There is confusion. And in aviation, confusion is dangerous, because every second matters. And every incorrect assumption can make things worse. The aircraft begins to descend rapidly. The nose remains high. That is a critical mistake. In a stall, the correct response is simple, but counterintuitive. The pilot must push the nose down to regain airflow over the wings. But here something is different. The captain is not pushing forward. He is pulling back. Why would an experienced pilot do the opposite of what training demands? The crew communicates with air traffic control. They report a flame out on both engines. That statement immediately changes the nature of the emergency, because a dual engine failure is one of the most serious situations in aviation. But is that really what happened? Or is it a misinterpretation of what the instruments are showing? Inside the cockpit, alarms continue. The aircraft loses thousands of feet in seconds. The descent rate increases beyond control. The first officer repeats the warning. It is a stall, but there is almost no response. The cockpit falls into partial silence, not because nothing is happening, but because the captain is fixated on one problem, the engines, and that fixation is preventing him from seeing the real threat. So what exactly is happening to the engines? Investigators would later discover something crucial. The engines did not fail. They were still producing power, but the airflow into them was disrupted. At high altitude, the air is thin. The margin between safe flight and stall becomes very small. This is known as the coffin corner. But why did the aircraft reach that dangerous boundary? To understand that, we need to look at what happened just before the stall. The aircraft had climbed to 33,000 feet. That altitude was chosen based on weight calculations. But those calculations did not fully account for one important factor, the anti-ice system. When activated, it draws energy from the engines. That reduces available thrust. At lower altitude, this is manageable. At high altitude, it becomes critical. As the anti-ice system was used inconsistently, the engines were not producing the thrust needed to maintain speed. The autopilot tried to compensate. It kept the aircraft level, but to do that, it gradually increased the nose angle. The aircraft pitched up slowly, almost imperceptibly, and as the nose rose, the speed dropped. This is a dangerous combination, but the crew did not notice it in time. Why didn't the autopilot disconnect earlier? That is another key question. Normally, if the aircraft approaches a stall, the autopilot should disengage. But in this case, it stayed engaged longer than expected. A manufacturer bulletin had warned about this exact scenario. It explained that under certain conditions, the autopilot could maintain altitude while allowing airspeed to decay dangerously. But there is no evidence that this warning ever reached the airline. By the time the autopilot was disconnected, the aircraft was already on the edge. The speed was critically low, the angle of attack was dangerously high, and the margin for recovery was almost gone. The descent to 31,000 feet was the right decision, but it came too late. And then something else happened, something that pushed the aircraft beyond recovery. The storm around them intensified. Strong updrafts began to form inside the cloud system. An updraft is a vertical column of rising air. When an aircraft encounters it, the nose can pitch up suddenly. That is exactly what happened here. A powerful updraft lifted the aircraft's nose even higher. That increased the angle of attack beyond the critical limit, and in that moment, the stall became unrecoverable. The engines responded to this sudden change. The disrupted airflow caused them to lose thrust temporarily. This is called rollback. It is not a failure. It is a reaction to disturbed airflow. But to the crew, it looked like both engines had flamed out. That reinforced the captain's belief, and it pulled his attention even further away from the real problem. Now the aircraft is descending uncontrollably. The rate of descent exceeds 12,000 feet per minute. The forces inside the cabin are extreme. The structure vibrates violently. Communication becomes difficult. The first officer continues to call out the stall, but there is no coordinated response. The cockpit lacks clear leadership, and without coordination, even trained pilots can lose control of the situation. So why didn't the first officer take control? This is where human factors begin to emerge. There is a significant difference in authority between the captain and the first officer. The first officer is younger and less experienced. In high-stress situations, this can lead to hesitation. He recognizes the problem, but he does not override the captain, and that moment of hesitation becomes critical. For nearly 3 minutes, the aircraft remains in a deep stall. It continues to fall from the sky. There is no recovery. There is no stabilization, only a continuous descent toward the ground far below. The passengers have no idea what is happening. Inside the cockpit, the crew is fighting a problem they do not fully understand, and then everything goes silent. But the biggest mystery is still ahead. If the engines were working and the aircraft was structurally sound, then what truly caused this disaster? And why did the crew fail to recover from a situation they were trained to handle? The wreckage lies scattered across a remote field in Venezuela. By the time investigators arrive, the reality is already clear. There are no survivors. 160 lives have been lost. It is the deadliest aviation disaster in the country's history. The aircraft is destroyed, but not fragmented in midair. That detail matters, because it tells investigators something important. The aircraft was intact when it hit the ground. So what brought it down? The investigation begins immediately. The site is isolated and difficult to secure. Armed protection is required. The team has limited time each day. Every piece of evidence must be documented quickly. The first question is simple. Did something explode in the air? Investigators examine the debris field. They locate the main sections of the aircraft. The wings, the tail, and parts of the cockpit are all present. There are no signs of an in-flight breakup. That possibility is ruled out. Attention turns to the engines. The crew reported a flame out on both engines. If that is true, it would explain the sudden loss of altitude. But the physical evidence tells a different story. Both engines show signs of high-speed rotation at impact. That means they were producing power when the aircraft hit the ground. So the engines did not fail. That raises a critical question. Why did the crew believe they had lost both engines? Investigators now focus on the cockpit recordings. The cockpit voice recorder is recovered and sent for analysis. When they listen to the final moments, something becomes clear almost immediately. The first officer repeatedly identifies the problem. He calls out that it is a stall. But the captain does not respond to that warning. Instead, he continues to focus on engine performance. This disconnect becomes one of the most important clues in the entire investigation. So what exactly is a stall, and why is it so dangerous? An aircraft flies because air moves over its wings, creating lift. If the speed drops too low or the angle of the wings becomes too steep, that airflow breaks down. Lift disappears. The aircraft can no longer stay in the air. This is a stall. It can happen at any altitude, but at high altitude it is far more dangerous because there is very little margin for recovery. The investigators now know the aircraft stalled, but that leads to a deeper mystery. How does a modern jet with 2 functioning engines stall at cruising altitude? Under normal conditions, this should not happen. The engines provide thrust, the wings generate lift, the systems protect against such situations. So something must have disrupted this balance. But what? The flight data recorder provides partial answers. Although some data is corrupted enough, remains to reconstruct the sequence of events. The aircraft was flying at a high altitude, close to its performance limits. The airspeed was gradually decreasing. The autopilot was maintaining altitude by increasing the nose angle. This combination is extremely dangerous, but the crew did not notice the slow decay in speed. Investigators then examined the weather conditions. The aircraft had flown into an area of severe turbulence. The atmosphere was unstable with strong vertical air currents. In such conditions, even small disturbances can have major effects on aircraft performance. But turbulence alone does not explain the stall. There must be another factor. The next theory is icing. Ice can form on the wings and disrupt airflow. It increases weight and drag while reducing lift. That combination can lead to a stall. The aircraft was equipped with an anti-ice system designed to prevent this, but the crew did not use it consistently. At first, this seems like a strong lead, but further analysis reveals something surprising. The engine data shows no increase in power demand. That means there was no significant ice buildup on the wings, so icing is ruled out. Now the investigation hits a wall. The engines were working. There was no ice. The aircraft was structurally intact, and yet it stalled and fell from the sky. Investigators return to the beginning. They re-examine every decision made during the flight. They look at weight calculations. They review the climb profile. They analyze the performance limits of the aircraft. And slowly, a new picture begins to form. The aircraft had climbed to 33,000 feet. That altitude was near the maximum for its weight and conditions. At that height, the air is thin. The engines produce less thrust. The margin between safe flight and stall becomes extremely small. Investigators calculate the aircraft's performance under those exact conditions. They include weight, temperature, and altitude. And the results are revealing. Even with a heavier load, the aircraft could maintain level flight at that altitude. So weight alone is not the cause. But when they include one additional factor, everything changes. The anti-ice system. When this system is turned on, it draws power from the engines. That reduces available thrust. At lower altitudes, this is manageable. At higher altitudes, it can push the aircraft beyond its limits. This leads to a crucial realization. The aircraft was flying too high for the conditions while using a system that reduced engine performance. That combination caused the airspeed to drop. The autopilot tried to compensate. It raised the nose to maintain altitude, but that only made the situation worse. The aircraft was slowly entering a stall without the crew realizing it. But one question still remains. Why didn't the crew detect the loss of speed? Why didn't they take corrective action before it was too late? The answer lies in what they believed was happening. They thought the engines were failing. That belief shaped every decision they made, and it prevented them from seeing the real problem right in front of them. The investigation is getting closer to the truth, but the most critical piece is still missing. What exactly caused the crew to misinterpret the situation so completely? And why did they fail to recover even after the stall warning activated? Investigators now focus on the final and most important question. The aircraft stalled. The warnings were active. The first officer recognized the problem. So why was the recovery not executed? Why did the captain not push the nose down and restore airflow over the wings? The answer lies in a combination of human factors, technical limitations, and a chain of small decisions that aligned at the worst possible moment. The cockpit voice recorder reveals a critical detail. At the exact moment the aircraft entered the stall, both engines experienced a rollback. This was not a failure. It was a temporary reduction in thrust, caused by disrupted airflow, due to the extreme angle of attack. But to the captain, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a dual-engine flameout. That misinterpretation changed everything. The captain becomes fixated on the engines. His attention narrows. This is known as tunnel vision. In high-stress situations, the brain focuses on what it believes is the primary threat. Everything else is ignored, even critical warnings, even direct input from the first officer. In this case, the captain is convinced the engines have failed, so he responds as if that is the emergency he is facing. But the aircraft is not suffering from engine failure. It is suffering from a stall, and the correct response to a stall is very specific. Reduce the angle of attack, increase thrust, stabilize the aircraft. But the captain does the opposite. He continues to pull back on the control column. That keeps the nose high. That prevents the wings from regaining lift. And that locks the aircraft into a deep stall. The first officer continues to call out the stall. He identifies the correct problem, but he does not take control. He does not override the captain. This is a breakdown in crew resource management. In modern aviation, both pilots are trained to challenge and intervene when safety is at risk. But in this cockpit hierarchy, and stress prevent that from happening, the result is silence when action is needed most. As the aircraft descends, The situation becomes physically overwhelming. The rate of descent exceeds 12,000 feet per minute. The forces inside the cockpit increase. Vibrations intensify. Communication becomes harder. The crew is now fighting not only a technical problem, but also the physical limits of the aircraft. At this stage, recovery is almost impossible. Investigators calculate that the aircraft was only seconds away from recovery earlier in the sequence. If the descent to 31,000 feet had been completed, the airspeed would have increased, lift would have returned, the stall could have been broken, but the timing was off. The stall occurred just before that recovery point, and the subsequent actions prevented any chance of correction. Now the investigation turns to the broader system. Why was the aircraft operating at such a critical altitude? Why was the anti-ice system not factored correctly into performance calculations? Why did the autopilot allow the airspeed to decay without disconnecting? Each of these questions reveals another layer of failure. The performance analysis shows that the aircraft could safely operate at 33,000 feet, only under ideal conditions. But with the anti-ice system active, the maximum safe altitude was lower. The crew did not account for this. That miscalculation placed the aircraft in a narrow performance margin where even small disturbances could have major consequences. The autopilot system also played a role. A manufacturer bulletin had warned that under certain conditions, the autopilot could maintain altitude while allowing speed to drop dangerously. This creates a hidden trap. The aircraft appears stable, but in reality, it is approaching a stall. There is no evidence that this warning reached the airline or the crew. Without that knowledge, they had no reason to expect this behavior. The weather added the final trigger. The aircraft encountered a strong updraft inside the storm. This sudden vertical force increased the angle of attack beyond the critical limit. That pushed the aircraft into a full stall. From that point forward, the outcome depended entirely on correct pilot response, and that response did not happen. The investigation also uncovers deeper systemic issues. The airline was under financial stress. Crew members had not been paid for months. The captain was working a second job to support his family. Fatigue, stress, and pressure were all present. These factors do not directly cause accidents, but they influence decision-making. They reduce situational awareness, and they increase the likelihood of error. Training is another critical factor. Investigators find that the crew did not receive adequate training in stall recognition and recovery at high altitude. They were also not properly trained in crew communication and coordination. In a situation like this, those skills are essential. Without them, even experienced pilots can make fatal mistakes. The final report concludes that the crash was caused by a combination of factors. The aircraft was flown at an altitude that was too high for its weight and environmental conditions. The use of the anti-ice system reduced engine performance. The autopilot allowed the airspeed to decay without warning. The crew failed to monitor critical parameters. The stall was not correctly identified by the captain, and the recovery procedure was not executed. But the most important lesson is this: accidents are rarely caused by a single failure. They are the result of a chain of events. Each link may seem small on its own, but together, they create a situation that cannot be recovered. In this case, that chain included technical limitations, human error, environmental conditions, and organizational weaknesses. In the aftermath of the crash, changes were implemented. Training programs were improved. Greater emphasis was placed on stall recognition and recovery. Crew resource management was reinforced. Airlines were required to ensure that safety bulletins reached their pilots, and performance calculations were reviewed more carefully, especially in challenging conditions. West Caribbean Airways did not survive the aftermath. The airline ceased operations and disappeared. But the lessons from Flight 708 remain. Every time an aircraft climbs to high altitude, every time a crew monitors airspeed, every time a pilot challenges a decision, those lessons are being applied. Because in aviation, safety is built on memory, on understanding what went wrong, on ensuring that the same mistakes are not repeated. And that is why this story still matters today. Every aviation disaster teaches a lesson, and every lesson makes flying safer for all of us. If you want to understand what really happens behind these incidents, subscribe to the channel and stay with me for the next investigation.